All right, hi guys. So we're going to be talking about the universal monarchy of God, right? The universal reign of God or the sovereignty of God. You might have heard it that way. Um, and of course, we don't have any sovereigns in our country because we're a democratic republic, but it's always good to learn governances from other countries. And of course, God reigns on, kind of similar to a monarchy, right? When the Israelites asked for a king, he was like, he didn't want that because he was their king, right? So he was the one that was ruling them. And of course, that's called a theocracy, right? Where God is the one who's reigning, and then you're listening to those laws by the prophets or the judges. If you read the book of Judges, he's also sent those people to reign out his laws. But you may be unaware that we've actually have laws before sin. So there's a law that God made during creation, so like the laws of the universe. And then we have laws that were established after the fall of man because God's holy and he still wanted connection with you know humankind even though we were at a fallen state. So he kind of gave us the law of like atonement, right? When he slain the sheep and gave them clothing, after they kicked them out of the garden. Um, and of course, we'll get into that. So the law. Actually, we'll start this way. So, I got these little pictures here. So, like, when you think of sovereignty, you should think of, like, like God on the throne. And obviously, like, this is like some Orthodox depiction. This is an older one. This is a more modern, like, imagery of, like, the Trinity on the throne, right? Because, they're the ones that establish it together. The Trinity made creation. The Holy Spirit was hovering over the waters, and like Jesus was the voice that walked in the cool of the day, things like that. Um, but of course, sovereignty is an important issue because a lot of people don't believe in God or don't want a relationship with God because of this. And mostly because it has to deal with just this idea um, of us wanting to be in control. And of course, that's just because of our free will, right? But of course, our free will is tainted because of sin. Um, and we just want to be like having the world in our understanding. Like, we want everything to make sense, right? So we're like, well, I wouldn't have done that if I was reigning, right? But obviously, we're not God. And a lot of people don't like that response, right? Because you'd be like, oh, well, why this? And you're like, well, because God's sovereign. Like, he chose to be that way. And that's why a lot of people have problems with submitting, right, to God's will. But that's why we're supposed to be praying to have God's will because it's going to be the only thing that's standing, right? Because it's existed since then, right? Since the beginning of time, and it's going to be there at the end of time. But yeah, like you can find God's universal reign and monarchy just in the creation story. You can find it in the judgments of nations, when he's just like, okay, you guys had your time, you've had your chance. I'm gonna send in some armies to invade, That's what we kind of call like the judgments of nations, you know. Um, when we're like petitioning in prayer, you're praying for God's will to reign, you know. And then in Job, we get to see this idea of like the courts of heaven written, because obviously a lot of this stuff was oral history, right? And or visions from prophets that may have not written stuff down, right? Obviously Moses did write a lot of stuff down with his visions and stuff. Um, but yeah, we can see that and like the Old Testament all over the place. But you also see this in the New Testament, right? Because Jesus is coming back and he's going to have a millennial kingdom. And Jesus, is the soon coming king, right? So he's going to be coming in to reign and establishing. Right now, he's sitting at the right hand of the Father, but he's going to be reigning here on earth. So that's why kind of like sovereignty is kind of an important issue that you see, just like an important theme that's just carried through the whole narration of the Bible. Right. Okay. So now, not to confuse sovereignty with providence, providence is kind of like how God exercises his sovereignty everywhere. Well, sovereignty is just him being on the throne. So like God's providence would be like, okay, you get time, right? So like time's a law that was established before sin. We also have like worship was a law that was established before he made creation, or even the angels, right? And just knowing God. And we got like seed time and harvest. That was established after the law, but after sin with Noah, but it was still a thing even in the garden, right? And of course, like a law before sin was do not do not eat of the fruit of good and evil, right? You can or the knowledge of good and evil. Like you can eat the other fruit and not this one, right? And of course, that's because God gave us free will, and free will is a test to prove um, if we're willing to follow the natural laws, out of love, right? And of course, now as Christians, we should be a lot easier since we're not under the law. We have grace under Jesus' atonement. But, you know, you see that with just our free will, right? And it's like our free will is challenged like every day. And it's a test every day, right? But again, just to emphasize, like the law after sin is because like God gave us like Leviticus and Deuteronomy, just because God was holy and then He wanted to be with His people. He wanted to dwell with His people, right? And of course, He was with Israel at the time, but He was still, kicking it with just modern, well, not modern man, but like, you know what I mean, like regular people, right? Um, we got like our little Moses right here. So yeah, so let's just kind of look at sovereignty. So God issues out laws, right? So if you're familiar with like the judicial system or like our civic laws, stuff like that, um, we kind of use the term court. So some people call it heavenly court, some of them call it like the divine court. Either way, this is how like God issues out judgments, right? And obviously, like most people have a bad like understanding of judgments because they're thinking it's going to be a negative thing. But if you're under the covering of Jesus' blood and atonement, and then you're under His grace, right? So and it's going to be wiped away on the books, right? And the book of life and that's kind of the thing that God wrote, for every individual before time, right? Because He's the author of like everything. And again, this has to do with His sovereignty, so it's His will. So when you're praying for God to do His will in your life, you're asking, that you're following the storyline that He has intended, and then like God forbid you make an edit in your own story from like you just acting in rebellion, right? But yeah, so like a court um, is often, we'll see this definition, like a palace, a place that a king resides or a sovereign prince. It's also a place where justice is administered. So, like, you have like all your laws established there um, and written out or orally decreed, right? Because there's a lot of like ancient courtroom stuff that I won't get into. We might talk about it in Zoom if you want to talk about that. But yeah, so you can have like, you have counselors, right? So as Christians, we're kind of like, up there in heavenly places with the Father. So He lets us know, and like that's how we're praying, right? So He might let you know ahead of time, like the prophets, or like saying like, hey, you should pray or intercede for this person. So like you get like the counsel of the King. Not like you're telling God what to do, but He likes to let us know stuff, so we can pray about it, right? Because He won't let His friends like out of the loop, right? And of course, you also get like like courting a person like dating, so to address to gain favor, that's another thing is that we're trying to gain favor with God, right? So these are just some verses that kind of establish um, or mention God's sovereignty, right? And I'll have an assignment for you guys to kind of look through and search for things that have to do with God either on the throne, mention that He's sovereign, or that God is reigning, or like His glory reigns, or like His majesty, things like that. And we'll talk about that in Bible study on Zoom. And this is just kind of here to just kind of like establish some things, get you thinking, kind of start doing some research for our discussion. But yeah, so like Psalm 29:10, like Yahweh sits on the throne at the flood. So he was the one that decided to have the flood, and he's sitting as a king forever, right? And of course, we'll see that again in the gospel, or in the church age, after when Jesus comes and reigns on the throne, and he established that covenant with David, which we will also talk about covenants at a separate thing, because that also kind of has to do, well, everything it really has to do with God's sovereignty, right? Because he has like an overall narrative, an overall will for things, and that's how we get atonement and salvation, how we have prayer and communion, um, things like that. Everything has a purpose, and he has that purpose for his, elect to do his will. Um, and yeah, and of course, like, God, when he does make judgments, you know, he judges fairly and righteously, and he has no partiality, right? So it's gonna be a very fair evaluation. When we make it up there in heaven, or if we survive long enough for the rapture, right? um, yeah, this is just like an example for like appointed times. That's something that we see as individuals. And of course, like this for Proverbs, this kind of covers like our need for self control and our kind of like wanting to do things our own way. But as you can see in Proverbs 19:21, like that only thing will stand is God's counsel. So like we really can't do much unless it's in God's will. Otherwise, just I think there's a verse that says like if the Lord um, builds a house and the labor's not in vain, right? So we want to do stuff like that. Yeah, so like even like anything random, like casting a lot or a dice. Every decision comes from the Lord. So you'll see kind of if you read like some of the sacrifice systems, like God's like, okay, we're gonna draw some straws and see who survives for like the goats. And he sends one out to the scapegoat goes into the desert with all the sin, and then the one that gets slain stays, right? Obviously he dies, but yeah, like that was casted by lots, but obviously God had the ultimate decision in that. That's why Jonah was thrown over the boat. And he knew he knew that like God was in control of that decision too. Um, but yeah, so we're gonna end things up, wrap it up with this. Isaiah 24:5. So Isaiah is kind of like issuing a decree of why the people are now in judgment, and like the earth is cursed because they didn't follow the laws, they didn't follow like the statutes, and they broke the covenant that Abraham made with God, right? Things like that. So like the law is like an oral thing. It was orally given. So these are kind of like the ones that God gave at the beginning of the universe, and the statutes are like the written common law, right? Which we normally think of as like the law, like the law of Moses. But also like the oral laws are kind of also like Ten Commandments, like boom. And then like statutory laws, the written common law would be like Deuteronomy, like the laws of the people, and like the laws for the Levites as well when you read like Leviticus, right? So yeah, it's kind of like different levels of the law, but that's kind of how God reigns and makes his decisions and stuff. Um, yeah, but people always ask like, "Oh, why this? Why that?" And like the simplest answer is because God wills it. That's why people always answer like, "Oh, because it's in God's will." Because it's a very complicated matter to get into like God's sovereignty and like his providence, right? Because his providence is how he exercises the thing. So like in Job, it was God's providence for him to suffer, right? Because he let that happen in court. Like Satan showed up and was like, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And God's like, "I mean, sure, if you want to do it." Like, and Job like suffered, but he never like cursed God, and he was talking to God the whole time, even when he was complaining. So that's why God has so much confidence in him. Um, but yeah, so I'll in the Zoom calls we'll kind of like look at the assignments and have like a discussion over this. Okay? All right.